There are two kinds of endings: the kind the world stops to witness, and the kind that passes through history like a door closing in another room. Barely audible, barely noticed, completely permanent. On December 14th, 1972, humanity left the moon. Not temporarily, not as a planned pause. We left, and we have not gone back in over 50 years. But here's what makes that strange. Nothing went wrong. No disaster. No catastrophe. No mission failed. We simply stopped. And that might be the more unsettling fact. For most people, the story of going to the moon is a story about arrival. Neil Armstrong, July 1969, one small step, the whole image. Flags, footage, the world watching. In collective memory, the Apollo program is a monument, something we built and left standing. What rarely gets examined is what the monument is actually marking. Not a beginning, an ending. A window of time, roughly 3 years long, that opened and then quietly closed while the world was looking elsewhere. Between 1969 and 1972, 12 human beings walked on the lunar surface. 6 separate missions. Scientists collected 842 pounds of lunar rock. Astronauts drove a rover across craters. By the final mission, the program had refined itself, the hardware more capable, the science more sophisticated than it had ever been. Apollo 17 even carried the first professional geologist to ever reach the moon. They weren't winding down. They had finally figured out how to do this properly. And then it ended. The last man to stand on the moon was Gene Cernan, commander of Apollo 17. Before climbing the ladder back to the lunar module, he paused, bent down, and traced his daughter's initials into the dust. T.D.C. Tracy Dawn Cernan. He had promised her they would stay forever, because on the moon there is no wind, no weather, no erosion to disturb anything. Those initials are presumably still there right now, undisturbed, exactly as he left them. Then he said something that wasn't meant to be a farewell. We leave as we came, and, God willing, as we shall return. He believed it. It became, without anyone officially deciding it would, the last sentence spoken by a human being on another world. Nobody announced what that moment actually was. There was no press conference, no address to the nation, no headline that said, "This is the last time." The decision to end the program wasn't made in a single room on a single day. It was assembled slowly, buried inside budget documents, congressional appropriations, and administrative reshuffling that had nothing visibly to do with space at all. 3 missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, had already been planned. The hardware existed. Crew assignments were being discussed. They were removed from the schedule so quietly that the public barely registered it as a decision. The Saturn V rockets built for those canceled missions ended up in museums. You can still visit them. They're lying on their sides under climate-controlled roofs. The largest machines ever constructed by human beings, never flown, perfectly preserved. That detail sits in a strange place. It's not a tragedy in the conventional sense. No one died. Nothing exploded. They're just there, intact, complete, and permanently grounded. Monuments to missions that existed on paper and nowhere else. Why did it end? The simple answer is money and politics, and both are true. The original engine of the Apollo program was never really exploration. Kennedy's 1961 declaration was geopolitical. It was about demonstrating that democratic capitalism could outperform the Soviet state on a stage visible to the entire world. Once the flag was in the lunar soil in 1969, that engine had served its purpose. The race was won. What remained was expensive, scientifically valuable, and politically unremarkable. And it was competing for budget space with a war in Vietnam that was consuming both money and institutional attention on a massive scale. By 1972, NASA's budget had already been cut by more than half from its Apollo-era peak. None of that is irrational. Budget trade-offs involve real constraints and real consequences. But what's worth pausing on is how the decision was framed, or rather, that it was never framed at all. Nobody calculated out loud what stopping meant across time. The assumption seemed to be that this was a pause, a temporary recalibration, that the moon wasn't going anywhere and neither was the capability to reach it. That assumption turned out to be wrong in a way nobody quite predicted. Here's what actually happened to that capability. The knowledge required to execute an Apollo mission wasn't just stored in blueprints and technical manuals. It lived in people, in the engineers who had spent years solving specific, unrepeatable problems, the precise metallurgy of particular components, the judgment calls embedded in mission protocols, the intuitions built through iteration and failure and correction. That knowledge aged. It retired. It died. When engineers decades later went searching for the original manufacturing processes for certain Saturn V components, they found documentation gaps they couldn't bridge. The machines in the museums aren't only relics. They're the last surviving evidence of a set of competencies that no longer fully exist. In a very specific and non-metaphorical sense, we forgot how to do this. Think about what that actually means in terms of lived experience. Every person alive today who is younger than roughly 53 years old has spent their entire life in a world where no human being has traveled beyond low Earth orbit. The generation that grew up after Apollo, and the generation after them, and the generation after that, all of them have only ever known a civilization that looks at the moon and does not go. That's not a background detail. It's one of the defining and least discussed facts about the era we actually live in, as opposed to the era we sometimes imagine ourselves to be in. There's a specific kind of institutional forgetting that happens when a capability disappears gradually rather than catastrophically. If a disaster had ended the Apollo program, if lives had been lost on the lunar surface, if a mission had disintegrated, the ending would be marked, memorialized, understood as a hard boundary. But this program ended without drama, which meant it ended without a clear timestamp in public consciousness. The result is a persistent gap between what people believe and what is true. When asked, many people assume humanity has returned to the moon since 1972, or assume the gap has been far shorter. The actual number, over 50 years, tends to produce a delayed reaction, the kind of pause that happens when a fact sounds incorrect before it registers as simply, quietly, real. Television ratings tell part of the story. The first moon landing had stopped the world. The second had measurably lower viewership. By Apollo 17, coverage was contracting. The impossible had been normalized so rapidly that it had become, within 36 months, routine. And when something becomes routine, the decision to end it doesn't feel like a historic turning point. It feels like an administrative adjustment. That's the mechanism. Not ignorance. Not malice. Just the ordinary way attention moves, and the ordinary way institutions communicate what they're choosing to stop doing, which is, mostly, not at all. Cernan understood what had been lost better than almost anyone. He spent the rest of his life testifying before Congress, writing about it, saying in interviews that the thing that genuinely troubled him wasn't being the last man on the moon. It was still being the last man on the moon 20 years later. Then 30. Then 40. He said it differently each time, but the core of it stayed the same. That the initials in the dust were meant to be a temporary goodbye, and somewhere along the way the temporary had silently become permanent. He died in January 2017. The return he kept predicting had not yet happened. His daughter was in her 50s. The initials were still there. What the Apollo engineers who are still alive tend to say, when they reflect on this, is not that the program should never have ended. They're practical people. They understand institutional realities. What they say instead is something more specific, that the ending should have been named. That there should have been a moment where someone stood up and said, clearly, on record, we are suspending human lunar travel indefinitely, and here is what that means. Because naming a decision changes what it is. It creates accountability. It creates the conditions for a real conversation about whether that decision should stand or be revisited. Without the naming, it just becomes the state of things, a fact with no author. The broader question the story raises isn't really about NASA or space policy. It's about how civilizations lose capabilities they successfully achieved. Not through conquest, not through forgetting the achievement happened, but through the specific mechanics of collective deprioritization, through the slow accumulation of competing urgencies, through the assumption that what has been demonstrated once is permanently available, that capability demonstrated is capability retained. That is an assumption worth examining, because the historical record doesn't consistently support it. There are places on the moon right now where the surface has been undisturbed for longer than human civilization has been keeping written records. And within that ancient stillness, in a very small set of locations, there are footprints. 12 sets, each one perfectly preserved by the absence of weather, readable at close range for millions of years to come. Long after every physical trace of 1969 or 1972 has decomposed on Earth, the film reels, the mission patches, the ticker tape, those impressions in the dust will still hold their shape. The evidence of a window of time, brief and almost accidental, when crossing to another world had become an ordinary scheduled event. Whether a new window opens is technically still an unresolved question. Programs are in motion. Timelines are being discussed. But the timelines keep moving, and 52 years is already a number that exceeds what anyone involved in Apollo imagined when the program ended. The certainty they carried, that the pause was temporary, that return was inevitable, has aged into something more complicated. On December 14, 1972, Gene Cernan climbed 9 aluminum rungs and closed a hatch. The world noted it briefly and then moved on. What nobody quite registered in that moment, what took years, then decades, to fully understand, is that the closing of that hatch was also the closing of something much larger. An era, a posture, a particular relationship between human beings and the distance beyond their world. It ended not with a statement, but with a ladder. Not with a decision anyone announced, but with a budget line no one quoted publicly. Not with grief, but with the slow, ordinary drift of attention toward other things. That might be the strangest part of all. Not that it ended, but that it ended like that. Quietly, completely, and without anyone saying goodbye.